ultimately, Will Cornick then stabbed Ann Maguire in the neck and back 7 times.
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised.
This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Grave Secrets. We're your hosts. I'm Beth.
I'm Annie, and today we have got another case study.
Oh, yeah.
So this one was in 2024, and much-loved Spanish teacher Ann Maguire was brutally murdered by one of her students, and he was just 15 years old. She was actually murdered in her own classroom.
Yeah, it's just horrific. She absolutely loved work, which we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So not only has she been killed at a place of work, she's been killed someone who's technically in her care.
Yeah.
And again, the age of the offender in this case is crazy. And what makes it even more harrowing is that she was just about to start a kind of new adventure in life, wasn't she, really?
So Ann Maguire had actually been working at Corpus Christi College for 40 years. So she was a well-established teacher, and she got a really good reputation as well. She was well-loved. And if you think back to school, you think about there was certain teachers that would inspire you.
Yeah, definitely. And not only that, but she was also a head of year. So she'd been head of year 11 for over 10 years.
Yeah.
Which, again, if you think of schools these days, they don't tend to have like heads of year for as long a period as 10 years.
Yeah.
But when you have someone that's such a big part of the school, they do become like a popular name, don't they? They're kind of the celebrities of the school almost.
And all the students had just been saying really nice things about her. They really liked her, didn't they? She was much loved by all the students.
And I think it sounds like she went above and beyond for quite a lot of pupils as well.
Yeah.
There were some students that said if they were struggling at home, she'd be checking in on them, or she'd be the first one to notice.
She's approachable. She's the one you can go to, isn't she, for anything.
And as well as that, I think there was also instances where one pupil hadn't turned up for an exam, and she'd actually gone round to their home and said, you know, what's going on? This isn't like you.
It's important.
But she was also a really good leader. So she, again, was a head of year, but all of the other staff members and colleagues really loved her. She was now just working 4 days a week because she was almost at retirement age and was due to retire within a year. Again, the head teacher was called Steve Mort, and he said that she was an outstanding teacher and leader, and that she really thought of work as more of a vocation.
Yeah, she wasn't just coming in
rather than just a teacher that's ticking boxes, because she taught over 3 generations of students in some cases, which again is crazy to think about.
So this is actually a case in Leeds. I don't think we've mentioned that yet. So it's quite close to us again.
Yeah.
And Ann Maguire did actually live in Leeds with her husband Don, and she had 4 children. So she had 2 of her own children, but then she had also adopted her 2 sisters. Her sister's 2 children.
Yeah.
When her sister had died. So I just think that's a really nice thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
And keep that family unit for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because her sister was only 35 when unfortunately she died of cancer. So she then became the mainstay of the family and said, okay, so it was her nephews, Daniel and Andrew, that she then adopted and said, you are now absolutely part of the family.
So she'd already got 2 girls of her own, and then her sisters were 2 boys, so she got 2 girls, 2 boys now.
Which is quite nice.
Yeah.
So Kerry, Emma, Daniel and Andrew were her sons, and then she had got 2 remaining sisters, and they were called Sheila and Denise. And again, they just spoke so highly of her. And again, you can tell what a wonderful person she was due to the nature in which other people talk about her, like especially her husband, Don.
So many nice things were said about her, wasn't there?
Yeah. So the school that we've mentioned is in Halton Moor, which is in an area of Leeds, and she lived quite close to the area anyway. And again, this case starts like a lot of others, where for Ann Maguire, this was just another day going to school.
It's a very
doing
normal
something that she loved.
School day. And she actually wasn't meant to be in school that day because she was meant to be going to watch her daughter dance. But I think it was the GCSEs that were coming up. So it was really important for her students. I think she thought she wanted to be there. So on the 28th of April, 2014, Anne just got up and went into school to teach like every other day.
It sounds like it was actually like an extra revision class that she'd put on, wasn't it, for the students? And so at around 11:45, again, she is teaching a Spanish revision lesson, and it's a group of 15, 16-year-olds that are about to do their GCSEs. They were imminent, and the pupils were split across two different classrooms. Again, quite often with these revision classes, you are kind of left to your own devices a little bit more, aren't you? Because Anne was probably just checking in with the kids as and when they may be struggling with something.
Or I thought if they were doing like a mock exam, she might have spread them out so they weren't copying each other or something.
Yeah.
But she was covering a bit more space, wasn't she, than normally everyone would have been in one classroom.
And she was actually marking some of the papers as they were going along. So Miss Maguire was leant over marking a student's work when a pupil called Will Cornick, who was in the lesson, decided to take a 21 centimetre knife out of his bag, walk into the room that Ann Maguire was teaching in, approach her from behind while she was marking the student's work, and ultimately Will Cornick then stabbed Ann Maguire in the neck and back 7 times.
This is horrific, and it's obviously a premeditated attack as well, because he's gone to the lengths of putting that blade in his rucksack and bringing it to school with him. So it is not just something that's spur of the moment and, your teacher's annoyed you.
Yeah.
He's planned this out from the start.
Yeah, and equally, I think this case is kind of quite timely in a way. Obviously, this was in 2014, but unfortunately, we are seeing a massive rise in knife crime cases, and they do tend to be of children who are at school age.
I was going to say it's younger, isn't it?
We had Alison come in, obviously talking about the murder of her son, which was knife crime right before his 18th birthday.
Yeah.
You think of the case down in London where a girl was murdered literally as she got off the bus. There have been quite a few Brianna's case. There have been quite a few horrific knife crime cases now, and unfortunately it does seem that it's becoming a bit of a pandemic.
It is. And in this case as well, Anne had been stabbed while she was totally defenseless. Like she wouldn't have known or had any idea of what was coming. And when she got stabbed the first few times, she then obviously tried to get out of the room and get away. But she just couldn't get away from Will in time.
And again, we talked in the last episode a little bit about how, the people that either witness or find a body of someone that's been murdered. Imagine, again, preparing, probably incredibly stressed already, preparing for your GCSEs and then witnessing someone that stab a teacher that you love. Like, it's just beyond comprehension. I can't even imagine how that would feel.
Yeah, for the rest of the students.
For the rest of the students. So ultimately, Anne did manage to leave the room and she fled towards a staff office. And at this point, I'm going to reference what happened next from the testimony of the colleague who tried to save Anne's life. This colleague was called Miss Francis, And she obviously gave a witness testimony when the case was heard, and she said that she was actually already in the staff office and heard all this screaming, she recounted, and students running down the corridor screaming and just looking absolutely terrified. She said that Anne came out and she was holding on to the back of her neck, and that she thought there was like a swarm of wasps or something. Because again, your mind goes anywhere but a knife attack in a school, doesn't it?
It was the last thing she was thinking of.
Yeah. And at that point, Anne just kept repeating, "He stabbed me in the neck. He stabbed me in the neck." She obviously came running into the room, but unfortunately, as you said, Will Cornick then proceeded to follow her, and thankfully, Miss Francis managed to shut the door, put her foot against it, and so was literally
She had to hold the door
fighting him
shut
off from attacking her further. But said that it all happened in like a split second, really, and that Will Cornick then just stopped and was just staring at her with no emotion, and just had no emotion in his face. And she said it was as if he had like a mask. He just didn't seem himself.
Yeah, and other students afterwards had said that after Will had stabbed Miss Maguire, he went back over to his desk, sat down and said, "Good times," really loud, so the rest of the class could hear. Like, it must have been in chaos already. And then there is just nothing. Even after he's done this, there is not one bit of empathy or remorse. Nothing. He's so calm in this situation, which is worrying.
Even with the weapon. So obviously he then couldn't get to Anne. So he just dropped the knife on the floor in the corridor, discarded the knife, and just left it there. So again, Miss Francis said that she could see cuts on Anne's jumper and that she was bleeding out of her neck. And Anne apparently, and this is horrific, and obviously the family have had to hear this, which is awful.
Yeah.
But apparently Anne was saying, "I can't breathe, I'm dying." And she did just say that she just kept stroking her and kissing her, and said that she knew she was dying, and she said, "All I could do was just tell her that she was loved."
Yeah.
And again, just to watch one of your colleagues die is just horrific. You can't imagine how much that would change your life.
Yeah. And with
forever.
And with Will being so calm as well, the teachers quickly managed to sort of intervene and get him down to the reception area where the police could then be called. But there's just no panic. There's nothing there.
So a man called Carl Sagar was the first paramedic to arrive on scene, and he actually said that in all of his career, the stab wounds that were inflicted by Cornick were the worst he'd ever seen. And again, just knowing something like that is terrifying, to think that it could happen in a school as well, and by a child.
The least place you probably expect something like that to happen.
So while this is all going on, again, Cornick is being incredibly cold and callous. He'd obviously disregarded the knife. It was teaching staff, which, again, very incredibly bravely then apprehended him to take him down to the reception area. But again, he just then sat and waited for the police to arrive. And, you know, staff members just couldn't believe it because, again, if we give a little bit of context into what Will Cornick was like, so he was born on the 26th of June in 1998. He was 15. He'd got loving parents who he had a close relationship with.
And a normal, loving, caring upbringing.
Yeah.
Which is what we've spoken about before. Everyone expects the offenders to be, you know, sort of brought up in trauma. Yeah. And this wasn't the case at all, was it, with Will?
He'd got an older brother. So again, he's got kind of a role model in his brother. He'd also got a younger stepbrother that he was really close to. His parents had separated while he was still in primary school. But again, that was all very amicable. The family were kind of still a unit, despite them not living under the same roof. They were open and communicative with each other. So there was just, as far as outwardly there were no kind of warning signs.
There wasn't.
And even Anne, and this again is just awful, Ann Maguire had actually described him in one of his reports just the year before as being bright and conscientious.
I was going to say this because he was quite an intelligent person as well. He had really good attendance at school. He was a good student, and obviously that was backed up by what Anne had written about him. And he'd actually taken his GCSEs a year early. So he'd obviously been that far ahead with things.
Yeah, because they don't do that very often, do they?
I don't think anyone in my school ever did that. So, that just shows in itself that this is not, it's not just some person who's being brought up wrong, or there's nothing really in his background that could,
like a trigger almost.
Yeah, and there's nothing to have shown either, so there was no warning signs with this.
People had said that he was a little reserved, but again, not enough to raise concern. However, it did come out after the fact, obviously, that he had expressed to other students a real strong dislike for Ann Maguire, which again only stemmed from an occurrence which had happened just 3 months before. So it's not even like this hatred has been growing and growing over years.
Yeah.
Apparently back in February, Ann Maguire had told him off for not having done his homework. Again, a very normal situation.
Yeah.
Likely, maybe he hasn't been told off so much before if he is really well behaved. And if he does tend to do his homework, then maybe she was one of the only people that had called him out, which is why this
and he didn't know how to
deal with it. Because you think of other kind of more badly behaved children, they probably get it from that many teachers. You wouldn't pick one to hate over the others, would you?
But it's all she'd done here is give him a detention.
Yeah.
So it's normal if you don't do your homework to get a detention, but I think it was what led on from that, because that detention then meant that he couldn't go on a trip. So it was a bowling trip.
Yeah.
So I think that had got his back up, but he did in fact just turn up on the trip anyway.
Yeah.
So he ignored, and so it shows how he's not listening to Anne here, is he?
But I found it quite interesting from a behavioural perspective, because if he is quite well behaved and quite studious and was then upset that he's almost been called out for not being studious, you would then think that the detention would be enough and then he would go back to his regular behaviour patterns.
Yeah.
But what he actually did was create more trouble for himself by turning up on this trip basically uninvited. He should have been in this inclusion unit for the day. So he's actually breaking more rules now. So it is interesting, because rather than him going back to behaving,
he's gone that step further, hasn't he?
To turn and now to further misbehave.
Yeah.
But obviously he then blamed that on Mrs. Maguire rather than his own actions. So this hatred did seem to develop, and he was obviously thinking a lot about this incident. But apparently the weekend before the attack, because it was a Monday morning that this attack had happened, but the weekend before, he had appeared normal. He'd seen some family. No one had suspected anything. He didn't seem, out of the ordinary.
When if someone was planning murder, you'd think, surely
they'd be distracted at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was literally nothing. Just spending time with his family as if everything was normal.
But then again, we've mentioned the calculated nature of this attack. Not only had he put this 22 centimetre knife in his bag, but he'd also specifically left his dad's house on that Monday morning, gone round to his mum's, then armed himself with multiple knives, which he obviously thought would be effective for killing, and then also stolen a bottle of Jack Daniels from his mum's house, which he was supposedly going to drink after the attack.
A celebration drink.
Yeah.
So it is very, very premeditated, because from start to finish, you've covered quite a lot. But we've said from the home side of it, there's not been any alarm bells that this has been happening. But from other students' side of it and his friends' side of it, there were quite a lot of alarm bells leading up to this. But in this situation where someone is saying, I hate the teacher, I absolutely hate them.
Yeah.
Like, we've all disliked teachers at school, and, you know, you might have gone on about it to your friends and gone on a rant about it. It doesn't mean you're going to
Actually act
on it.
No.
So I think that his friends in this case, he was messaging on Facebook, he was sending messages to his friends saying, you know, the messages were very strange, how he wanted her to perish, he didn't like her.
I've got a couple of them, actually, I'll read out.
Yeah.
But again, if you think of the amount of odd people that there were at school, like there were some kids that were doing really weird stuff at school, and you wouldn't think to report any of them. You just think like they're the weird kid. Do you know what I mean? Like, and even though he wasn't necessarily weird, he wasn't a real oddball recluse, he just had quite a dark sense of humour.
His friends said he'd got like this really dark sense of humour. And they just put it down to that and thought, well, he's talking about that again, or he's saying that again.
Yeah.
Because in the past he had made odd comments, hadn't
they? But there was a student called Zach, and Zach was obviously interviewed. And he was actually in an English class at the time of the attack, but knew Cornick quite well, and they were in the same form together. And on the Monday morning, he had actually, in form time, asked Will Cornick if he fancied a game of cards, because
this is what they used to normally do, isn't it? In a morning in the form time, they'd come in, they'd have a game of cards before they went to the next lesson. So that was like a standard thing, wasn't it? So it must have been quite, not like, I won't say friendly, but friendly to be able to do that.
Yeah. And so Zach apparently turned around and said, do you want to play cards? He said no. So Zach said, well, that's all right, because we can play tomorrow instead. To which Will Cornick is reported to have said, I won't be here tomorrow. Now, Zach said, again, and you wouldn't think anything of it, you'd just think, oh, he's going to skive.
Is he going to pull a
again,
sick
for anyone that's not from the UK, skiving basically means you
skipping.
Skipping lessons, skipping school. Or that he was feeling ill, or do you know what I mean? You just wouldn't think anything of it, would you?
No.
But it's, again, so calculated on Cornick's part that he already
knew the next day that he wasn't going to be there.
Yeah.
He'd gone through it in his head, hadn't he?
Yeah. And then again, there were other testimonies after the fact from students that had stated that Cornick had actually shown some of them the knives that were in his bag and told them what he was planning on doing. But again, nobody really took it seriously.
A lot of people...
This is a 15-year-old kid.
Yeah. A lot of people will be thinking, why wouldn't someone alert their teachers? Why wouldn't someone ring the police on him? But in this situation, because it is so severe, that there's something where you think someone else has already reported it because it's so serious. So
bystander effect.
Yeah, that's it, bystander effect. And you think, oh yeah, someone else will definitely report this because it's so extreme.
Yeah.
So you don't report it. But also there was threats to the students from Will Cornick.
Yeah.
So he had threatened the students that if they tell anyone, you know, something bad could happen to them. So I think it was like sort of a lot of fear for the other students.
I was just about to say, I think people underestimate when they hear about things like that. They underestimate the fear that these people are in. You know, even if you're a friend of Cornick's and he said something that you think might be dangerous, you don't want it to then come out that he's in inclusion because of something you've said, and when he gets out, then you're the next target. There is a lot of fear involved, and I think people are quite quick to judge a lot of the time, and that's not necessarily always the best way of dealing with something, because you don't know how you would react in that situation.
No. And I thought as well at one point, like with him telling so many people, I'm sure there was like 20 students that he'd gone around and told about what he was going to do. And you think, is he telling these people because he wants to be stopped, or was he going to go through with it anyway? Like what? There's no sort of logic behind it. And I think when we get a bit later on down into the case, it's pretty clear that I don't think he would have stopped at anything.
No. And it's also whether or not he was using it to kind of force him into going through with it. You know,
if you've already told people.
Yeah. And again, with this bottle of Jack Daniels, he'd apparently said to someone like, oh, afterwards it's going to be a party.
Yeah.
So, you know, he's making a lot of references and kind of bigging himself up. So whether or not he was then kind of forcing himself to go through with it. But ultimately, again, even with interactions with the police after his arrest, he was asking officers what their favourite films were.
That is so strange. Like, to even, he's as if he's not even in the moment. He's totally dissociated from it, hasn't he? Because
either that or he just doesn't have any remorse. He's planned it.
No empathy.
There was hatred, and he's effectively done what he's done. He's done what he wanted to do, so now the kind of consequences don't matter
because it's done.
Yeah, because it's done. Meanwhile, these poor traumatized students that have just witnessed this horrific murder of their teacher now have to be escorted out of the classroom, which is now a crime scene. The whole school is a crime scene, out to the library to provide statements. And you just think...
And all the rest of the school at this point is asking what's happened, because they're all on lockdown in the classrooms, like words getting round that something bad has happened, because these students that are in the other classrooms as well have seen the sirens turn up. So you've got the police, you've got the ambulance, and it's quite scary for them to think, you know, what has
going
actually
on.
happened.
Are we in danger? You don't know anything, do you?
No.
And again, at first... some of the students reference like how the day played out for them, and they said at first there was kind of a couple of whispers, but they weren't really worried. Then they were told that their class had been extended for another hour, and that's really out of the norm. So then you're probably thinking, what's going on? Then obviously you've got all the sirens and the lights and things. So then you're wondering who has been injured. Again, you would assume an accident or an injury rather than something being
intentional.
Killed. It's just one of the, and they said that it kind of took all day before they were able to. But again, you've got to think of everyone's perspective here. So, you know, parents and carers are probably thinking, my son or my daughter shouldn't have been left in that situation. They should have been allowed to leave. They should have been informed as to what was going on. But there's an investigation. It's not as simple as just telling everyone that a murder's just occurred. They've got to make sure that the environment's controlled. So there are so many factors that again go kind of unnoticed sometimes.
And at the same time as this is going on, the paramedics had got there and tried to fight to save Anne's life. Unfortunately, Anne did die, and then they've got the job of telling her husband, you know, he just thinks his wife's gone out to work on a normal day. So Anne's husband, Don, was called. And at first, even he thought it was some sort of accident. You know, he rushed to the hospital because he thought something must have happened at school. Maybe she's, you know, fallen, something's happened.
Yeah, they'd mentioned a knife, but he just thought that maybe her finger had been injured or something. He didn't obviously realise how horrific it was.
And it absolutely left everyone devastated. So obviously you've got Anne's family, and then you've got the full class of children that have just witnessed this, and they've all then got to be held separate, ready to talk to the police and then give all their statements.
And then you've got the teacher that was with her at the time. It's absolutely tragic. At this stage, obviously Cornick has been arrested. He's showing no remorse, but an investigation still then has to be launched. So obviously one of the first things now, modern day cases, all devices were kind of seized. So that was his mobile phone, laptop, any tablets he may have had.
And there was quite a lot of evidence on these as well. I know like nowadays kids are using like every form of, you know, like if you look through mine, I've got like phone, you've got your iPad, you've got your computer, there's all these social media sites. And I think that there was so much evidence within it just on social media, wasn't there, for this case?
Yeah. So there were photos of guns on his camera roll, photos of knives, again, leaning towards demonstrating an obsession with violence. There were also these multiple posts on social media that we've mentioned, but they were specifically declaring hatred for Mrs. Maguire.
Yeah, it wasn't just saying someone, was it? It was fully naming her as well.
And again, Will Cornick's never really said what the trigger was, but although this detention that he was given and the school trip incident had happened in February, and then as well as that, there were these direct messages which were from 2 months prior, which would marry up with this incident that had happened in February. And they were direct messages, and I am just going to read a couple out because I think that it goes to show the level of hate in this 15-year-old boy.
And intent as well.
And intent. So one of these messages said, "The only one absolute effing bitch that deserves more than death, more than pain, and more than torture, more than anything we understand." And so that was one message. And then there was another one that said, "As long as she's alive, I'll be depressed, sad, and angry. So there's only one thing to do." Again, saying that you're going to be sad, depressed, and angry just because someone's living, it is
Something
crazy
not
to
right
think that
in
there's a
itself.
fixation. There's such a fixation there, isn't there?
Yeah.
And then a third one said, "I'm not looking forward to tomorrow. We have Maguire and I want her to perish." It's just so violent, but also kind of so insipid. You can tell that he's really...
You can tell the hatred, can't you, coming from the messages.
He's really just put a connection on he was probably deeply unhappy himself.
Yeah.
But he's created this connection with Mrs. Maguire, and now it's just become his whole reason for hatred and pain, really.
On the other side of this, though, in terms of the school and after Anne's death, I do feel like they did really pull together, and they actually kept the school open, and all the children went in, and they sort of did like the grieving together, which was, I mean, it's not nice, but like comforting,
community,
I think. And they were writing the prayers in the chapel and putting them on the tree, and all that with them pulling together, I just thought was a really good sense of community.
And I think in some of the interviews that you can see with some of the students, obviously they're a lot older now, but when they've been interviewed, they do reference that. And they say, you know, the school, for those that were doing their GCSEs, they said, look, the school is still going to be open for those that want to come in and grieve together. Obviously, it was a Catholic school, so it was quite prayer-based.
Yeah.
But it seems like they just had quite a good support network there. And really celebrated Mrs. Maguire's life through the pain.
And I saw some of the interviews with the students, and they were saying that they did actually manage to get good GCSE results. And they were saying, it's because we knew that she wanted it for us. We knew how she was committed to us, and we sort of wanted to do her proud, and she was looking down on us. And I was like,
they actually got the best
results
on record, which is unbelievable
to say what they'd all seen,
because the amount of disruption that would be the case after the fact as well. Obviously, that level of the school was then closed off for months. They were having to do lessons in like sports halls and things like that. So it's not like everything just goes back to normal, even if you know who the offender is. You know, an investigation still has to take place.
Yeah.
Ultimately, in this case, Cornick did confess to police that he admitted that he'd committed the crime. It'd be very difficult to argue otherwise. But
when you've got 30 witnesses at least, haven't you?
He did admit to it. He actually stated that he decided to commit murder 3 years prior, which would make him just 12 years old.
Yeah, he was having these thoughts when he was so young, and he'd planned to do it in school again, and he wanted to kill teachers, but he wanted to, there was a male teacher, and then he said, he quoted, "I want to get 2 in 1." So he was planning on killing the pregnant teacher. Which, like, that to be planned. Imagine that teacher hearing about this afterwards and thinking she didn't know how much like danger she was in at the time by just going to school and going to work.
Yeah. So these statements that Cornick then started making came out through psychiatrist reports, because obviously he's 15 years old. This is a horrific, brutal crime that he's committed.
There's got to be a
He's
question
showing
over his mentality.
remorse. Yeah, he's showing no remorse whatsoever, and he's got this proclivity for violence. So there was a psychiatrist that was put on his case, and he said that it was called John Kent, and he spent around 7 or 8 hours with Will Cornick. And John stated that he was calm when he talked about the murder that he'd committed. He showed no remorse. Ultimately, Cornick said, "I wasn't in shock, I was happy. I had a sense of pride, and I still do. I know it's uncivilized, but I know it's incredibly instinctual and human. Past generations of life, killing is the root of survival. It's kill or be killed. I didn't have a choice. It was kill her or suicide."
Where are these strong feelings coming from? I can't fathom, like, yeah, you might not like someone, you might dislike someone, but to this level.
To me, I think there must have been a switch in his brain, and there is another thing that we're going to talk about in a second, which is a potential trigger.
Yeah.
But to me, I think it must just be this deep level of self-hatred,
Yeah.
which he's then unfortunately connected to Ann Maguire through nothing but happenstance.
Yeah.
And then unfortunately, he's just associated that hatred outwardly towards her rather than inwardly. I think that's the only thing, really.
That's the only explanation. So the psychiatrist's job was basically to do like a deep dive, find out what the triggers were and see if he was actually of sound mind when Will had killed Anne. And there was something else that came up, which I was quite surprised about, that was thought at the time maybe could have been some sort of trigger, but has not been proved or anything like that. So years earlier, Will Cornick had actually collapsed and was diagnosed as an insulin-dependent diabetic. Was it type 1?
Type 1, yeah.
Type 1 diabetic. This in itself wasn't a particular trigger, but it was the aftermath of it. So when something like this happens and it is such a life-changing thing, Will had wanted to join the army. And once he was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, he was no longer able to sort of pursue probably his dream job.
Yeah.
And they thought it was maybe the consequences of that had on his mental health.
Yeah.
And it might have been it is a life-changing situation.
So someone in my family is type 1 diabetic, and I know that when they were young, they were diagnosed, again at a similar age, because it was 2 years prior that he was, so he'd have been 13 when he was diagnosed. It caused depression in them, because it meant that they couldn't play football to the same extent. They would have to think about food. Obviously, you're now having to self-inject on a regular basis. You are constantly feeling a level of unwell. Or not constantly necessarily, but, quite often if your blood sugars drop, you will feel a shift. So you're probably not feeling like yourself.
You've got to learn to live your life a totally different way, haven't you?
Yeah.
And that can be tough. And if you've got something that is your dream job and then someone tells you can no longer do it at 13, I'm not surprised that would have an effect on someone.
And I think if it triggers something like depression or a depressive episode, and then you're told that it's going to have a knock-on effect to what you thought your life was going to pan out, you can understand that might be a trigger. And his friends did say that's what caused this dark sense of humour. And that he had become quite morbid in the way that he referenced death and things like that.
But you think there's lots of people that have been diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic and not gone on to obviously kill people. But there was a switch in him at that point.
But what was really clear in all of these interactions with the police and the psychiatrist, John Kent, was that there was a complete disregard for his actions. Cornick also stated that he didn't care that his students had to witness these heinous actions. He didn't care that the victim's family would be upset and that they'd have to hear about what had happened, because in his eyes, quote, everything was fine and dandy. And basically, he was happy with his decision, so nothing else mattered.
The consequences didn't matter either in this way.
No.
And to say fine and dandy.
And there was, again, further evidence uncovered to suggest that it was calculated and that Cornick was manipulative, because in 2013, in December, it was actually on Christmas Eve, he had messaged a friend on Facebook saying that he wanted to murder Mrs. Maguire, and then once he would be arrested or, found that it was him that had committed the offence, he said, oh, well, I'm going to say I heard voices to get comfy walls.
So he's already looking into his defence strategy at this point.
Yeah. And that was, a year before? So that's at the age of 14. It's just unbelievable. And what I find interesting as well is there's clearly an immaturity in talking about planning murder on a social media site where everything is tracked, and he's quite clearly immature in the fact that he doesn't understand that would have repercussions.
Yeah.
But then he is thinking about ways in which to get away with murder.
Yeah.
So it's a real kind of...
I think it's quite scary looking back over the way that he, sort of planned it and dealt with it.
And the level of knowledge of these topics. Do you know what I mean? It's incredible.
And he was actually determined to be of sound mind at the time of the murder. So that was what the psychologist said. The thing, though, about this, and in a way this is a good thing, because Will Cornick had pled guilty, there didn't have to be a trial. So the family don't have to relive the trial. It just goes to a hearing where the evidence just gets put across. It's more of there's no jury or anything.
Yeah, so there's no evidence called up in terms of specifics, but effectively what has to happen is the prosecution has to outline to the judge the circumstances, the factual circumstances of the killing that they can state. So this hearing began on the 3rd of November in 2014, and again the family still had to hear about the circumstances of the death, so it's not evidence as such, but it still is.
Yeah.
Ultimately, thankfully, Cornick was sentenced to life in prison. That was with a minimum of 20 years,
and he showed no emotion.
The prosecutor, Paul Greaney, stated that the circumstances of the killing in this case were savage.
Yeah.
And that the 15-year-old's life had been marked by love and support.
His family were really upset by this as well. They were so concerned and so, I think, probably confused as well as to where everything went wrong, because there was no warning signs for them.
No.
And then you're stuck at the point between, that's your son, who in your eyes has not showed any signs of anything. How can he just go and do that?
No.
But then he's showing no emotion. So I think the family Will's family really struggled with that.
And the prosecutor actually said to Cornick's parents, Ian and Michelle, that this appeared to be a sunburst of violence, and it was a mystery because he's not giving anything away. Ultimately, again, Gurney told the court it's important that we should record that it is clear from the evidence that the parents are decent people and responsible parents. And I think that was a really kind of nice extra almost that the prosecutor mentioned, because he was basically saying, look, you've done all you can, this isn't anything on you. Unfortunately, it's just the path that Cornick, their son, has decided to go down. So the sentence is good. It's a hefty sentence, 22 years, again, for someone aged 15. He'd have been 16 at that time, I think, wouldn't he?
I still think, though, in terms of the family, it's hard because they still don't know why. there was no reason that were big enough to do anything. Not that there ever is, but like in anyone's eyes to do something like that. And I feel like the family probably still thought there were a lot of unanswered questions.
Yes.
As in, could the murder have been prevented in the lead up to it? You know, he still managed to get his hands on knives. He was looking at content online. He was bringing them into school. He told people about this.
Yeah.
You know, if all of these people or just one of these people had said something, could the murder have been prevented? But then Zach, one of the students there, did say they thought that if it didn't happen that day, he probably would have just gone on to do it the next day because he was so determined.
Yeah.
So they did say, didn't they? They didn't think that it would have been able to be prevented.
Ultimately, Don, Anne's husband, did kind of state that he wasn't happy with the way that the case was dealt, and then did go on to seeking more answers. And I think it's important that we do talk about that a little bit because, again, we talk about Ann Maguire, but it's the family that are affected, and it would be amiss of us to just, you know, not mention any of this. So Don did say that there was no contact from the head of education at Leeds City Council or the council's head of children's services.
I can't believe that.
Even just to acknowledge what had happened. No one came to discuss what had happened, and he says that no one helped them understand. Like, again, anything, not even we're sorry, not, you know, just no explanation whatsoever, and they kind of just left then to deal with it on their own.
I also thought about the her children. Obviously, she got her two own children, but the two sons that she'd also adopted, they've lost their mum, and now they've lost their other mum, like another mum, haven't they? Another mother figure.
Yeah.
Which is awful as well, along with obviously Anne's other children.
So Leeds City Council refused to conduct a serious crime case review into Anne's death. They were told...
I don't understand how.
The family were told that it didn't fit the criteria. That's what they were told. The council instead undertook something called a learning lessons review. And this
Even
learning
the name
lessons
of that.
review, was a process that stretched out over 2 years. But this was all behind closed doors. So no one was allowed to access the information. And ultimately, this concluded that the tragedy would not have been or could not have been avoided. But, you ready for this? In this 2-year review, learning lessons review, they didn't interview any pupils whatsoever to get a gauge on the crime. And the report justified in recognition of the significant trauma and emotional impact on those involved. That's all it said.
If I was Don in this situation, I would be fuming because it's like nothing's been done, but then they're fobbing you off with this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it is. I think that was important to mention because
definitely.
You've got the trauma of your wife and your family members' murder, and then you want answers, and they're effectively saying it's not a case that we're willing to take on
because it doesn't fit a certain criteria.
And I did mention earlier on in the episode, about how knife crime is becoming a bit of a pandemic, unfortunately, in the minute, and so I just wanted to reference a couple of things about knife crime. Again, there was a case in 1995 which kind of resurfaced in the wake of Anne's murder, but that was where a head teacher had actually been stabbed to death at St George's Roman Catholic High School in Maida Vale, London. And that was the head teacher, his name was Philip, and again, he was stabbed when he tried to break up a fight.
Right.
So it's not the first time that a case like this has occurred. And Behaviour in Schools report conducted in September 2023 brought together a load of responses from over 6,500 UK teachers, basically asking, a bit like a census would, asking for their opinions on safety. And it found that 37% of teachers, respondents, had experienced physical abuse or violence from pupils within the last 12 months of their role. So that's not within their career, that's within
Just
the last 12 months.
Yeah.
And 90% reported verbal abuse or violence from pupils. 89% feel the number of pupils exhibiting violent and abusive behaviours has increased.
Yeah.
And that would make sense given
the stats,
some of the
isn't
crimes
it? Yeah.
and the stats that are coming out at the minute. And that was in 2023, so it's not, it's not all that long ago.
Yeah.
And I just think it's important that we just keep talking about things like this. And, Alison's work, and there's a lot of other charities out there
that are doing really good work just to
prevent
and just to raise awareness on it as well, and sort of get it before it escalates to this. If, the younger generations, I know Alison is doing a lot of work with the quite young kids.
Yeah.
Which is getting it
just
before it's
thinking about
happened.
your actions, there's other ways of protecting yourself, consequences, and just general education.
Yeah.
So as always, with this case, we are going to end on Anne's memory and how her family are helping her memory to live on. So there is actually the Ann Maguire Arts Educational Fund, and that was set up in 2014, and this provides bursaries and funding through music, drama, language and dance, which are all subjects that she loved, and obviously then goes towards funding students in those areas. And just a couple of quotes from her family. So Don said, "Anne was a very loving, dedicated wife and a natural mother. It was her natural mothering qualities, I think, that made Anne such a wonderful teacher." And her nephew, Daniel, but her son, effectively, said that as a child looking at his mother, you were 10 feet tall and made of steel. You weren't, of course, but you were a very content 5'3" with the warmth of a loving mother and the heart of a lioness.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah. So I think hopefully we have shed some light on that case. Again, remembering Anne for the wonderful woman she was, and
the work she did as well.
Yeah, and just going to show that ultimately you can't ever, pinpoint who is going to become a killer.
Yeah.
It's just the work around preventing it in these cases, and the important work that investigators do to make sure that justice is received.
Yeah.
So thanks again for that one. We do have some exciting things coming up, so keep an eye out for all information about those things.
Make sure you're following us, because we put a lot out on our socials, especially on sort of Instagram, TikTok now, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Speaking of exciting things that we've got going on, we are really excited to be supporting the American Theatre of London, and they are holding a brand new play at a brand new theatre.
Wow.
So they've partnered with CrimeCon UK, and we will be attending CrimeCon Manchester this year.
We'll put a link in if you want to get your tickets.
Which is partnered by True Crime.
Yep.
And they are running this play called Down the Road between the 4th and the 29th of March. The play itself follows a journalist couple who basically dive into the depths of a serial killer case. So they decide to interview a sadistic serial killer that's in prison, and they then uncover this moral dilemma which blurs the line between journalistic integrity and then glorifying the actions of a serial killer. So it's quite a good one for like this moral and ethical debate.
It is, because we've spoke about how like a lot of things that we watch or do sort of glamorize it quite a lot, and that's what we really try to not do within our podcast, isn't it?
So this play is really interesting because it plays on that question. So it will be absolutely incredible, and it's at a brand new theatre and arts centre. So this is Playhouse East in Haggerston down in London. So if you're able to, make sure you get there for opening week. And if not, then you will be able to see the play right up until the 29th of March. And it just seems like it's going to be one of those that it's going to leave you thinking, oh.
Yeah.
And then when you leave, you're going to just be asking each other so many questions like, well, what would you have done there?
Yeah.
Or what do you think about this?
Yeah.
So yes, we again will be posting lots of information about it. You can get tickets on Eventbrite, but we'll be posting information and links for you so you can access them there. And we're looking forward to seeing it ourselves.
Yeah.
And as always, thanks for listening. Take care.
Bye.